how to paint trees and 4 tips on how to do so. Let's get started. Okay, now as I get started here, the first step to painting these trees, or painting trees the way that I like to do it, is to lay out a clear idea of what you want. So before we consider color, before we consider the details, how the light is going to hit these trees, we want to make sure that we have the shapes correctly, we have the perspective correct, and just kind of everything established so that we have a good idea of where we want to go with it. So what I mean by this is that in general, as you watch me do this, I know where the leaves of the trees are going to be, I know where the shadows of the trees are going to generally be, and I know which color each tree is going to be. So I've got a yellow tree, which I'm working on now, and then I add the shadows kind of down lower near the ground, which is just naturally where I know they're probably going to be. And then this tree to the left of that yellow tree is going to be a red or orange colored tree. Then I'm going to have a tree that has already dropped its leaves, so it's going to be sort of the color of tree branches, and I'm not really focused on a lot of bright colors, but more or less just trying to get the appearance of some branches. And then I'm going to have a 4th tree, which is going to be a much brighter yellow colored tree than that first one I laid down. And so I'm just using this flat brush and just blotching on the shape of the trees with the closest color that I can think of. And then just adding a bit more appearance of that tree with the no leaves. And so another thing to point out as I'm using this flat brush is that this wide brush, the reason I'm using it is to try and resist adding too much detail. So just trying to get the idea onto canvas laid out before anything else. So almost immediately in this process, you'll see me start to lower the tree line down into the grass more. And so this goes back to that tip that I have of be willing to make changes. So right away, I decide that I want those trees to be a bit lower. So I just kind of lower that shadow line a bit more into the foreground. Then again, right away, back to my first tip, which was work from the back to the front. I'm now adding a tree in front of those trees I just added behind it. So I want there to be some larger trees. So I just go ahead and lay in the idea of the tree trunk and the branches, and then I switch to a smaller filbert brush because I want these leaves to be more individual, more specific, more detailed, just because they're closer to the viewer. So kind of quickly, I'm just going through the area and I'm getting the idea established of where my leaves are going to be in the sky. Now, a lot of this might be covered up as I work on the sky behind it, but I want that idea there so that I can visualize where these trees or how these trees are going to look further down the road. Here is where I made my mistake. I had thought that I had the color that I wanted. I thought that I had step 2, which was establish the color, completed. And so I went right into the details. The reason that this ended up being a mistake was later on in the painting, I realized that the way that the light hit these trees, which affects the color, just wasn't correct. They needed to be a bit darker than what I had created them, and we'll get into that in a bit. But anyways, here is one of the reasons why I didn't want to skip over this part, because I did actually keep some of this in the finished result. So if you look at most any tree, one thing that they all have in common is we can see a lot of what's behind the tree through it. So a lot of the trees don't cover up everything. There's lots of little tiny holes where either the light shines through or the sky shines through, whatever is behind it. And so what I'm doing here is I've mixed the color of the sky and I'm just dotting on little itty bitty patterns all over the upper parts of those trees to give us that idea that we can actually see through those leaves and those branches. And you don't have to be too particular about this. You know, it takes practice. It takes a lot of patience to do something like this, but it's fairly easy to do once you get the hang of it. Just add on random little areas where we might be able to see through the branches or see through the leaves. And then give yourself some larger areas to break up as well. So you can see I'm adding some bigger patches of sky kind of right in the middle of this red tree. And look how that brings just so much life to the tree. All of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, that actually does kind of look like a real tree now. So I guess that's kind of a third tip that I have is not all trees cover up everything that is behind the tree. Make sure that we can see through the tree in certain areas as well. What I'm doing here is just continuing on with that pattern of going from the lights to the darks and just using that round brush, and I'm just spotting on those dark areas and spotting on those highlight areas. So as this red tree comes together, and I was thinking of this myself as I was in the middle of this painting, it looks like a very nice tree. There's nothing wrong with this tree that I'm creating. But the problem that I had with it later on was that the lighting, like I said, just wasn't correct. And I actually was talking about this in the middle of this painting, that this tree would be perfectly fine if the lighting had been coming from more behind the viewer. But that wasn't really the case with this painting. Our light was more so coming towards us, which would mean that the highlights of the trees should actually not be present as much. I kind of sped up the rest of this as I did end up covering it up. But I'm just going through the same process with the rest of these trees, just going from the highlights to the shadows and just spotting on as much detail as I can. And here again, as I move to this larger yellow tree off to the right, I'm breaking it up with the color of the sky just to give the appearance that we can see through those leaves and those branches. Now, here's where I basically started the whole process over. I don't need to go back to step one, which is have a clear idea, because I still feel like I have a clear idea of what these trees and the shape of them are going to look like. But I need to go back to step two and establish the color again. So because I want these trees, because I've decided that they need to be more backlit, I've just mixed a darker version of all these colors. So a darker red, a darker green, and a darker yellow. And I've covered up about 90% of these trees with those darker colors. I am leaving a bit of highlight on the left side of those trees because I feel like I could probably get away with some of that sunlight hitting the left portion of those trees, just leaving some of that on there. I could probably get away with a little bit of highlight there on the left is what I'm trying to say. But I'm not worried about detail. Again, you can see as I go back to this previous step, step two, I'm just not worried about detail. So I've switched to a little bit of a larger filbert brush and I'm scrubbing on the color that I want to appear. Now I can switch to step three again, which is add the details. And this time I'm going about it a little bit differently. So I've decided that I want to have some darker tree trunks and tree branches because our trees are backlit. I felt that we could probably see those darker tree trunks now. And I'm just going to build this up together. So adding the darker tree trunks, then breaking up those upper areas of the trees with the color of the sky like I did before. And adding a little bit of highlight detail on the left portion of those trees, just feeling like I can probably get away with some of that. So I'm adding some of those highlights back, but being very more careful with how much I add. Now that I've got some of that started and I feel like I have a good, clear idea of where I'm going, I'm moving to that tree that's above, and closer to the viewer. And I'm just adding some tree branch detail to that one, and then going right back to the red tree and getting those dark tree branches and tree trunks in place as well, like I did with the yellow tree off to the left there. Once again, I'm moving back to the color of the sky, and I'm trying to break up a lot of areas between the red tree and that darker yellow tree off to the right here. And so this time I go a little bit further with this breaking apart the tree portion, and I'm adding a lot more patches of sky color. Now before I get to that larger yellow, darker yellow tree kind of off to the right there, I want to get these larger leaves in place on this tree that's closer to the viewer because I don't want to create extra work for myself. I'm trying to save time here as well. So I've got a rough idea established of that yellow tree behind, and now I'm adding these larger, darker, orange-colored leaves over the top and seeing if that will cover up a lot of imperfections of that tree behind it. What I've learned is that sometimes you don't need to add a lot of detail when you layer different trees in front of each other because a lot of those trees that are in front cover up a lot of the things we don't like about that unfinished tree behind it. So as you can see, as I'm adding these larger orange leaves, that yellow tree behind this is almost just starting to disappear, and it becomes just sort of like a subtle idea that it is there. And even without the detail present, it's starting to look pretty good. So now I'm adding some more tree branches and tree trunks. I kind of want some trees in between this large one and those ones back behind it. And once again, layering on some larger leaves, this time adding some green leaves. So I'm trying to add a lot of variation in this painting. But what's important to note here is that that yellow tree behind these leaves is almost completely disappearing. So I did end up saving a lot of time by not overworking that yellow tree behind. And pretty soon, at this point, we can just see little specks of yellow, which give us the indication that there is a tree back there. And we didn't really have to add any detail at all. So now here you can see I've begun to make some changes once again. So back to my tip of be willing to make changes. I decided that I had too many leaves protruding out into the sky. I wanted to back that up a bit. So I just took my round blender brush, I mixed the color of the sky, and I just simply covered it up. And that was it. I ended up having to put another layer over the top just to finish that off. But it was pretty simple to make that change. So be willing to make changes and be willing to teach yourself how to make changes. That's very important in just kind of being happy with the end result. Now I'm going back to just adding some highlights to these green leaves. Just taking that round brush and just stroking on those highlights. Okay, so now that those larger leaves are established, I can move to that area behind again and kind of work my way downwards. So at this point, I'm very happy with how these trees are looking and how that light's looking. And so I am adding a little bit more highlight, but again, I'm being more careful with how much I add, just little patches at a time. Then moving to that yellow tree off to the left and just repeating the process with some bright yellow color, just spotting on some highlights. And we're starting to get into step 4 here. But I'll just kind of wait as I go back to the color of the sky again and breaking up the trees. So at this point, the trees still felt a little bit off to me. I felt that we could add more realism. And so the first thing that I kind of defaulted to was I must not be able to see through the trees enough. So I mixed that color of the sky again, and I kind of went to town this time. And I added a lot of areas that give the appearance that we can see through these trees. And I went lower down into the trees, and I just sporadically added this sky color all over each individual tree. And so you can see as I do this, it really starts to bring everything to life. And I especially started to realize this myself when I got low into this dark red colored tree. And I added those sky colored spots low in the tree. It just started to make sense to me, like, yeah, that's about right, because trees just aren't that thick. If you just go outside and look, pretty obvious right away when you have that on your mind of how much sky can I see through the tree. It's a lot. So once I added that sky color, things really started to take shape, and decided just to keep going with this detail, adding some more tree branches, some more tree trunks. And that was it. So now I'm on to the 4th step, which is show the light. Now, just as we can see that sky color through the trees, we should be able to see that light through the trees. So I'm carefully spotting on the colors of the highlights throughout the tree. So this gives the appearance that we can see through and be able to see those leaves that are highlighted on the back side of the tree. So it's those leaves that are right on the outer reaches of the other side of the tree. They're being highlighted by the sun. So we are showing the highlights of those leaves projecting through the tree. I hope that makes sense. That's a lot. But anyways, show the light. That's very important. So take those highlights at the end and figure out where they need to be. And don't be afraid to just add those highlights. Increase the intensity and be very bold with them, because all trees have highlights, whether that's on a cloudy day or a sunny day, probably more so on a sunny day, but we can always see highlights. Make sure that you are showing those highlights where they need to be. And so you can see I even go all the way over to that darker portion to the right. And as I spot on those highlights, suddenly it gives us the appearance that we can see through all of that forest to some itty bitty highlights that are on the back side. And that just brings a lot of depth to the trees. It gives us perspective. It allows us to imagine in our head how much forest is there, you know, maybe the distance, we can like, oh, okay, so we can see all those tree trunks and then the highlights on the other side. There must be some distance in between that. So it gives us perspective as well. And the final thing I'm doing is just kind of adding, again, this is kind of showing the light, adding some highlights by just putting in some other trees and some bushes and things like that. So I'm using a lighter color and just highlighting on the idea of maybe some different species of trees that have lost their branches, things like that. And so that's basically it. When it came to the trunk of that larger tree, I just mixed some darker color and broke apart some of that highlighted area to give the appearance of some tree bark. If you want to know how I do tree bark, I'll have a link below. I did do a video in the past on how to paint tree bark. It's basically the same process for every tree for me. It might change a little bit with each species, but for the most part, it's about the same. All right, guys, well, that pretty much wraps up everything about how I painted these trees in this particular painting. I'm gonna cover a few other things, maybe the sky, the grass, a couple other things I have in mind that I'd like to share about this painting. So expect a couple more videos, maybe 2 or 3 more videos from this painting soon. And then it'll be on to the next one, which will be hopefully a trip in the outdoors where I'll get to share the experience. Actually, it will be, not hopefully, it will be. But anyways, thank you again so much for watching. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys very soon. If you have any other tips, any questions, anything at all you'd like to share for other artists, I'd love to hear them. Please leave it all in the comments below. Yeah, that's it. I'm out.